Today's video does contain subject matter that some viewers may find disturbing, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you would like to send my way, just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so, and of course, thank you. This happened back when I was a teenager. Probably about 15 years ago now. I lived in a smaller town where, if something happened to you, the whole town seemed to know before the end of the week. This also meant that people knew who not to mess with or talk about, if you catch my drift. I was just lucky enough to work for one of those people, and lucky that he treated me like his own daughter. I worked at a local pawn shop, and just in case, I'm going to make up some names too. It was run by a guy named Tony. Tony was a big guy, physically and in popularity and personality. Everyone knew him, and was either close to him, steered clear of him, or was on his bad side. My dad used to work for him, and I thought that he was a good guy, so he suggested that I apply at the pawn shop, thinking he would be able to help me get the job. Of course, it worked, and shortly after, his wife was showing me around and telling me how to use the register. I was mainly working after school, helping ring people up and cleaning up shelves. After I graduated, I continued to work there for a few years since I was making decent money and trying to go to a local community college. That's when I really started tackling the night shifts, and I got to see a bit more of why Tony was so popular. You see, the pawn shop was a legit business up front, and people were always bringing stuff to trade or have appraised. The size of the building was big enough to have quite the collection of stuff too, from housewares, toys, electronics, weapons, and a lot more. So, there were plenty of purchases being made all day long. But, at night, Tony had a whole other business being conducted in the back. He ran poker tournaments, and I'm assuming that's definitely helped fluff the numbers for the shop as well, as being why some of the people avoided him. As I got older and after I left the pawn shop, I learned that it definitely wasn't small bets going on back there. So, while he had his game going on in the back, he had someone running the front, leaving the store open often late into the night. This was used as a cover for why they were still open, I suppose. Once I turned 18, I started working that same late-night shift. Surprisingly, we still had some people coming in at night to look around the place. Or maybe Tony's friends picking up some consolation prizes. We also had people coming in at all hours, with all kinds of odd items, looking to make some fast money. After watching others and being taught some of the simpler methods of inspecting items, I was able to offer prices as well. I also learned how to put my foot down and not get walked all over when it's not what they were expecting. I also had Tony and Margaret on my side in most cases. So, when I had a guy come in with some old comic books, I expected the whole thing to be pretty routine. It was super late when this guy came in. I remember this because I figured it was just another one of those guys that was expecting me to not look too closely, thinking I would be too tired or uncaring. I've had people come in with things as stupid as a rock, and trying to claim it was part of the boulder that sealed Jesus in his tomb before he came back. The problem with this assumption was, 1, I don't half-ass things when my boss is Tony, and 2, I'm actually an avid comic book collector, thanks to my dad. So this guy comes in with one of those bank boxes that was heavily damaged. The bottom of it looked soft and warped like it was wet and recently dried out, and there was no lid. And this already had me thinking that the comics were probably in bad condition. He did have them all in sleeves though, so I guess he had that going for him. He said that they were all original prints, and that we should be grateful that he chose us to sell them to. I started pulling out a few of them to inspect them, but I could instantly tell that they were not as rare and special as he implied. To not bore anyone with the details, I'll just say that the most damning part was where the copyright and pricing was obviously altered, as it was slightly skewed, and you could see a fine dark line, like something was printed or stamped there. It wasn't raised like it was taped over, but I've seen that too. Hoping to not cause a scene, I offered the guy like $25 for the box. There were probably about 100 or so comics in there, and I was expecting to throw them in the $1 or less comic bin that we had, so we could make some kind of profit off of them. The guy reacted like I had just kicked his dog, saying that he had rare comics in there. I told him that there may be some rare ones, sure, but due to the damage that most of them had, they're not worth it to go through each one separately. I then suggested that he take them to an actual licensed appraiser, and then he could come back and we could talk more then. Or he could sort through them himself. He then said that that was the reason he brought them here, for me to do it. Again, I told him that I wasn't a licensed appraiser, and also, I didn't have the time to go through his stuff. But he begged to differ, claiming that that was my job. After some petty arguments and name-calling, I then said fine for that. I'll take the whole box for $10, or you can get out. And that's when he really started throwing the derogatory remarks, and saying that I didn't know anything because I was just some naive little girl. Channeling my inner Tony, I yelled at him to get the hell out, and to take his crappy knockoff comics with him. His idea for a response was to threaten me, and said he would come back and slit my throat while he stood over my body. Now, I can usually be pretty level-headed, but that caused me to really scream to get the F out of my store. Of course, this got the guy's attention in the back, so Tony and one of his friends came up and asked what was going on. I told them what had happened, and what his response was, but Tony was already walking up to this guy, ready to toss him out the front door by his ears, I'm sure. But the guy quickly walked out with his comics without another word. We all watched for a bit, making sure that he actually left, and then went back to our night. I know that I did a few things around the shop, watched some movie that we had there, and I helped escort some of Tony's friends out, but the rest of the night seemed to go fine. It was probably somewhere around 11 p.m., and that Tony came out and told me that I could go ahead and head home. He usually stays behind to lock up, and I'm still very thankful for that fact. As I was walking to my car, which was at the edge of the lot, it wasn't very big, so probably 5 or 6 spots from the building, I walked by a car that had just turned their headlights off. Normally, I wouldn't think much of this, but since we were closing, it caught my attention that they were turning off and not coming back on, like they were going to leave. I had stopped just past the car, and I watched as the comic guy got out of that car. I immediately was on edge and started putting my keys between my fingers, contemplating if I should run to my car or towards him to run back to the building. I chose to run towards the building, praying that I would get Tony's attention. However, I could hear him speeding up towards me as well. But as soon as I grabbed the door to open it, I felt my hair being pulled, knocking me to the ground. I yelled for Tony, and thank God, he had excellent hearing. Or something. because he swung that door open so fast, smacking my ankle with it, and that guy was immediately on the ground. There were some good punches being thrown by Tony, as well as a few threats before he finally let that guy leave. I know he tried not to scare me any more than I already was, but the guy had a knife. I saw it fall to the ground, but I was in such a shock that I didn't even think about picking it up. Tony did, though. He hid it from me as he went back inside. I know that he didn't want me to call the cops because of his things in the back, so I didn't. I did tell him that if the guy came back during the day, I would consider it since he wouldn't have anything going on, and he agreed to that. He made sure that I was okay, though, and he followed me home just to make sure I was safe. I also ended up getting a nice extra bonus that week for my hard work, quote-unquote. Tony had always been like another father or uncle to me, and I never had problems with him, so I definitely didn't want to cause any problems for him. So, yeah, I may have been stupid for not calling the cops, but the fact that I never saw that guy again made me think that Tony probably got through to him. I was still pretty freaked out there for a few weeks when I had to work at night or work alone. I know that not every pawn shop is going to have someone like Tony, but a word of advice: threatening somebody over a few dumb comic books probably isn't good for your health. Oh, and to the comic book guy, you had better hope that we never meet again. I have quite a few horror stories from when I was a front desk attendant for a hotel, but most of them take place when I worked the overnights for the same location. I have a lot of experiences with genuinely creepy and weird people, but I think it would be more fun to share one of the experiences that was a bit more unexplainable, and less just, this one guy was kind of creepy. So, as I mentioned, I worked as the overnight front desk attendant for this hotel for a couple of years, actually. The schedule kinda sucked, and I had to really work to adjust my sleep schedule, and it made days off incredibly difficult, but the pay was decent for the time. And, to be honest, I didn't have much going for me in my life beyond working there. The nights typically consisted of sitting at the front desk for hours, dealing with one or two people that would show up in the middle of the night, and because they spent too much time on the road. And sometimes, I would have to take things up to rooms if there was an issue or an emergency. Beyond that, I would sit at the desk and pretty much just file out the paperwork that had to be done each night. The story that I want to share happened during my first year on the night shift. I don't recall the time of year, but I think it was early winter or mid-fall. The whole thing started when I got a call from the third floor of the building. It was a guest that I had checked in at the beginning of my shift, and when I checked him in, he seemed like a pretty decent person. He seemed sane, stable, and polite enough. I know that it sounds weird that I'm saying this, but I am saying it to demonstrate that he probably wasn't crazy. Anyways, he called down and asked if I could help him, and he asked me if there was anything I could do about the temperature of the room. I mentioned that there was a thermostat in the room and that most of them were set to a pretty standard temperature, something like 73. He then said that it was set to 73, but that the room was feeling really cold by the door, like there was a major draft coming in from the hallway. And that was kind of weird since his room was literally in the middle of the hallway, so he was nowhere near any draft-causing spots, like windows or exits. I told him that I would go ahead and come up to see if I could help him out and check it out shortly. After I had hung up the phone, I went ahead and placed the "Be Right Back" sign on the desk and went up to the 3rd floor to see what was going on. When I got up there, I was a bit annoyed. The floor was a pretty standard temperature, but then I walked toward his room and noticed that this guy was actually not lying to me. As soon as I approached his door, it felt like the hallway went from this nice ambient temperature to about 20 degrees or so colder. We weren't booked full, so there was only one other guest staying in a room near him, and their door didn't feel cold, so they didn't have the AC on or anything else. But for some reason, the closer that I got to his door, the colder it felt. I knocked on his door to let him know that I at least felt what he was talking about. When he answered, I told him that he was definitely correct, that it was colder, but then said that I couldn't figure out what it was as there weren't any drafts, and there was nothing that should have been causing the colder temps. I then asked him if he wanted to go ahead and just move to another room, and after a bit of contemplation, he said that he would. We went through that whole process. I got him in another room down the hall, closer to the elevator, and I apologized for the inconvenience. He seemed satisfied with this resolution, so we moved on, and I thought that this was the end of it. Except, about 20 minutes later, he called down to the front desk again. This time, he was a lot less happy. He started going off about how someone had knocked on his door multiple times, but when he went to answer it, there was nobody there. This was a really weird thing to have happening, mostly because, like I mentioned, there was only one other person near him, and that person was an older gentleman that looked like he was there for business, not the type to knock and run. I pulled up the camera system to check if I could see his door, and sure enough, I could. I asked him when the last time it happened was, and he started telling me that it started happening almost as soon as he got settled into the new room, and that it had been happening every couple of minutes. He said that each time it happened, there would be no one on the other side of the door, so he assumed that they were knocking and running away. He then said that he had even walked around the hallways and not seen anybody hiding. As soon as he finished explaining this, I heard, clear as day, 3 very aggressive knocks on the door of his room come through the phone. He then got up and angrily said, "See, there's that SOB again." The problem was, I was staring at his door from the camera. There was nobody there. I even kind of said that under my breath, and at first I don't think he understood what I said, because he responded with, "Yeah, right, because they knock and they run away." I then reiterated my statement by saying, "No, sir, I'm looking at your door from the camera. There's nobody there. As in, no one came to your door and knocked at all." He paused for a moment, but came back with a much less angry and much more confused tone, saying, "But you heard the knocking, right?" I told him that I did hear it, but I said that at no point in time did anyone come to his door. Pretty much right away, we heard another very loud knock on the door, and he started saying, "Is there anyone there now?" To which I responded, "No." I could tell that he was starting to freak out, and to be honest, I was as well. Between the weird drop in temperature around his old room, and now this phantom knocking, it seemed like some sort of spirit or ghost was following him, and was seriously messing with this guy. I know it was just the 2 isolated events at this point, but they were bizarre and were not things that we had ever had reported. The knocking was definitely more terrifying than the cold spot, but Both events kind of had me leaning into supernatural or paranormal territory. After a few seconds of silence, I offered to move him to one of the more expensive rooms on another floor, basically upgrading him for free because of this. He did agree, and when he came down to the front desk, he was pretty pale, and quite obviously freaking out. I asked him if he was going to be okay, or if something else had happened, and he told me that as soon as he left his room with his stuff, he started hearing something laughing. I kind of passed over his comment and told him that we would get him taken care of. I got him in one of our most expensive rooms, which was not on the 3rd floor, and I told him that if there were any more issues, I would go ahead and offer him a full refund. He just kind of nodded and slowly stepped back to the elevator with zero energy in his step. A few things to wrap this story up. First things first, he did not have any more issues. When he checked out in the morning, I was told that he wanted to give praise to my manager for how I handled his issues, basically saying that I went above and beyond for him. And to anyone that will say that he was faking the problems or doing something to cause them, I'm going to say that I highly doubt it. The cold spot issue, well, I guess he could have had the AC on in the room, but that would be kind of dumb to do if I was coming up to see why it was cold. Plus, it felt like it was more in the hallway than coming from his room. The knocking thing, I'm pretty certain was not his doing. After I got him in the 3rd room, I actually went back and watched the camera footage, and unless he was so committed to the bit that he opened his door and looked around confused each time, and then left to walk around the hallway and angrily threw the door open for his act, all without knowing that I could see him on camera, mind you, then I'm pretty certain that it was real. On top of that, after he left his room, I saw him start to walk down the hallway. And then I watched him pause to look back and around for what I'm assuming was the laughing. I literally watched the color drain from this man's face on the footage, and there's really no way to fake fear that intense. Also, this was the only complaint that I ever received about all this, which makes me seriously think that whatever this was, it was directly attached to him. In the end, it was super weird and a genuinely creepy situation, and I kind of felt bad for the guy. By the time he got into the new room, it was already past midnight, and I'm concerned that he didn't sleep very well. I do hope that whatever this wasn't actually attached, and was just messing with him for that night for some reason, and I hope that he made it wherever he was going safely. And also, to that man, I'm sorry that your stay at our hotel was so eventful. I used to work at a restaurant that was open pretty late, but it was also attached to a bar that was open until midnight. When the restaurant closed, the bar stayed open and served some menu items, but not everything. It was normal for people to go to the bar and order appetizers and drinks, but they always pushed hard to get people to order more than that on the restaurant's side. They had a rewards program where you could get a free appetizer after 10 visits, so when they redeemed that, the manager always nagged us to push them into ordering a meal, or even dessert to try and recover the cost, I guess. Their beliefs, not mine or the other servers. So, anyways, it was one of those shifts that I worked until midnight, so I was going to be moving over to the bar side. I remember that it was almost 10 p.m. because that was when the restaurant closed, and we just had a couple, a male and female, come in and they had specifically asked to sit at one of the tables near the front door. This was actually pretty uncommon because most people wanted to sit in the booths which lined the sides or in the back. It wasn't something that caused me to become suspicious of them or think that they were weird or anything. It was just a bit out of place, is all. So, I got them seated, started to hand them a menu when they said they didn't need one, and then asked if they could just get the chips and salsa appetizer and 2 waters with lemons. Again, people did that a lot, so I didn't question it, and I took their order to the back. However, there were a few things that I did find a bit odd. Since it was so close to us closing, I did find it weird that they didn't just go to the bar side for chips. Those people typically went over there anyways, and those that just order an appetizer usually sit around and talk for a few hours. So, I will say that part of me was a little whiny when I started thinking that they were going to keep me here on this side of the restaurant longer, causing me to run behind on cleaning. We weren't allowed to sweep or vacuum the floors if there were any customers in the dining area, so I would have to wait until they were done before I could finish. But the other thing that I noticed was that both of the shirts they were wearing still had the tag hanging on them, right under the arm. I saw this when he was pushing the menu back at me, and when I brought out their drinks. She was tucking hers into the shirt. Again, it was weird, but I also have heard stories where people bought stuff, and they then just kept the tags on it so they could return it. Not my thing, but to each their own. I saw him tapping on the little table kiosk, so I figured he was redeeming the appetizer anyway. So if they were just cheap, then so be it. I made better tips on the bar side anyways. After I brought out the drinks, I walked by them once to let them know that their food would be out shortly, and they were very short and quick to dismiss me. Again, whatever. If they were going to be that kind of customer, then we'll just get through it and move on with my night, right? However, my boss did not see it that way. He'd been pacing the kitchen, and when he still didn't see a ticket come back for them, the only other occupied table was already eating, he questioned me about it, becoming impatient as he was wanting to go home too. There was another manager on the bar side, so unlike me, he was going to be able to just go home. I told him that they didn't want any entrees, they just wanted the appetizer. He became annoyed that he was being held back because someone wanted something they could just get from the grocery store across the street. His words, not mine. He then told me to go and offer them something else, like a beer or the daily soup or something like that, to try and get some money out of them. I reluctantly did what was asked of me. As I approached the table, I noticed that they were leaning in and talking quietly, but then stopped when we made eye contact. I didn't want to do this, as is, so I tried to be chill about it, mentioning that we had a new chili recipe and I offered some of that. Then the guy snapped back. "We just want our chips, man. That's it." So I smiled and said that's no problem, promising that I would be right back with them. I went back to the kitchen and told the boss that that was a no-go and started to grab their chips. He became more annoyed and told me to keep an eye on them, thinking they were just going to run out without paying. I tried to argue that they were probably just going to redeem the reward, but he didn't like to be told he was wrong, so I brought them their food and went back to the kitchen to talk with the chef. I don't really know what was up with my boss that night. He was usually an ass, but that night he was worse than normal. He would not let up on this couple. He stopped pushing the food thing because I guess he realized that that would have kept him there longer, but he was adamant that they were going to do a dine and dash since they got a refill and sat close to the door. So I was told to do a walk by their table every couple of minutes. And I mean literally 2 minutes max. The couple seemed to be just as annoyed as I was, because the last time that I approached them, the guy went off. But it was what he said that was concerning. I walked up to the table and I was going to mention paying at the kiosk when the guy yelled, in a cleaner version, "Dude, leave us the hell alone. We're only here for an alibi, for Christ's sake." He said this as if it was something a normal person would say, shoving another chip in his mouth. The woman would not make eye contact with me and continued to look down at the table. I just walked away and told my boss what they said, yelling at him that if he was so worried about it, then he could go talk to them himself. I refused to go back to that table, pissed off and also a little freaked out. Why would you say that out loud, and what would you need an alibi for? I told the chef about what was said, and I just walked by the doorway to see if they would leave a card or cash or something. However, we got the notification on the screen in the back that the chips were redeemed, leaving them with no bill to pay. So I checked again for them, and I saw them take off out the front door. I went over to their table, noticed that they took their receipt and nothing else. After that, I just cleaned up, still replaying the whole event in my mind. The rest of that night went fine, and thankfully, I never saw that couple again. I contemplated reporting it to the authorities just in case there was something more sinister behind that comment, but I was hoping he just said that to get me to leave them alone. Because if not, it was pretty stupid. When they redeemed their reward, it shows us the email address, name, and phone number for the account that was logged in. Sure, all of it could have been fake, but there was still a chance that it was real and could trace back to one of them. I held on to the info for the time being, until I heard reports about some car break-ins where someone had been shot and killed. One of them had happened that same night, and was within the general area. That was enough to at least report it to the police, just in case it could be related. Unfortunately, if it was, I never found out. I never heard anything about the case, or from the cops that took my statements, so I have no idea. I still do think about it at times, wondering how real that statement he made was, and also hoping that they don't think I'm a risk or try to find me. At least I don't work there anymore, or even live in the same state, so I guess I'm probably safe. So this was a collection of some creepy night shift horror stories. Some genuinely terrifying stories where working overnights is creepy. I messed that up. You know what? I'm gonna leave it. I'm not gonna redo it, because redoing things is not how I do my outros. So, working late night, creepy, yes, how that? Anyways, I don't really have any, terrifying night shift stories. I think the worst thing that ever happened to me on a night shift was whenever I worked at Blockbuster, and maybe I've told this story, if so, I apologize, but whenever I worked at Blockbuster, for the 4 months that I worked there, I was volunteered by the manager to do inventory. Didn't think it would be that big of a deal. Inventory does take a while, yes, but it's a Blockbuster, it's not a Walmart or a Target, it's not going to take all, multiple days, right? No. Inventory started at store closing, so I was told to be there at, I think, 7, and the store closed at 10:30 or 11, one of the two. So, anyways, we closed, and then, after that, we got started on inventory. It was me, the manager, the assistant manager, I think, and 2 other people. Yeah. So, Blockbuster inventory was a pain in the back end. And let me just say, it took us from 11 at night to 8 o'clock in the morning to get that done. I was not expecting to be there all night. I was not told what it entailed. I was not told that it was going to be an all-night endeavor, just that it was going to be an after-closing thing. Oh no, it was terrible. And I'm kind of glad the Blockbuster I worked at went under, so I never have to do it again. Also, I don't work there anymore, obviously, so not like I would ever be asked to. My point is, I hated it. Genuinely disliked it. And that's enough of my rambling for the day. So, friends, if you enjoyed this video, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel and you liked what you heard and like scary stories of all calibers, I do so very many of them, please consider subscribing. If you really liked what you heard, you can go down to the comments section down below and leave me a comment. Doesn't matter what it says, just leave it there. It's appreciated. So, there's also the things like Patreon, joining memberships, or Super Thanks. Super Thanks being a tip to the channel. Patreon and memberships getting you early access to content so long as I get them up early, which I do my best. And other good stuff, sometimes a lot. Yeah. I think I've said everything I have to say. Other than I hope you're all having a beautiful weekend. I hope, my friends, that I do see you on the next video, but until that happens, as always, you are loved, you are important, you are valid, you're the best you that you can be. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. And until I see you again, my friends, much love, and sleep well.